Hi, I'm Angela, and today we're going to be talking about why what Jesus did for us is so important. To know the answer to that question, we have to look at what he's told us. Jesus said, "These are my words, which I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms must be fulfilled." Luke 24:44. And what are the law, the prophets, and the Psalms? Jesus was talking about what we call now the Old Testament. The law and the prophets and the Psalms, or the writings, are just the Old Testament. They're the first part of the Bible. So what is the Bible? Some people get the wrong idea about the Bible. Some people think it's just a book of stories that somebody made up that aren't really true. Other people think it's a book of rules that God has made that just take the fun out of life. But God shows us that his book, his holy book, is an invitation to know him and to be close to him. In the Bible, God shows us who he is and what he is like, and it's amazing. He shows us that he is the infinite king of the universe, and he wants to be close to his people. He shows us that he is faithful and keeps his promises and redeems people from the beginning to the end of his special book, the Bible. He shows us that fairness, kindness, goodness, forgiveness, joy, and love all come from him, and he has them in an infinite amount. There's no limit to them. He has no limit to his power. He's all powerful. He knows all things. He knows everything that you think and say and do, and everything everyone does, and everything happening everywhere all the time. And he is everywhere all the time, in all of history at the same time. So think about it. The infinite, good, kind, amazing, loving Creator wants to be close to us. And what does that mean? Does it mean he wants to be right next to us? Well, we already know that he is, because he's everywhere all the time. No, it's not talking about that exactly. When we think about God being close to us, God dwelling with us, abiding with us, being at home with us, that's something deeper. Think about it this way. Have you ever had someone yell at you or be unkind to you or treat you unfairly? If you have, did you feel very close to that person right after they'd done that? Probably not. Imagine that someone broke your favorite thing. Think about your favorite thing right now. Is it a favorite book, a favorite toy, a favorite gift someone gave you? What would happen if somebody broke it, if they completely destroyed it? How would you feel? And then imagine if they didn't even tell you that they broke it. They destroyed it and then lied about it and tried to cover it up. That person might be in the same room with you, but you would not feel close to them at all. Well, the creator of the universe has guidelines for rules for how we are to be close to him, and we've broken them. We can't be close to him in our spirits. We can't be at home with him because of our sin. Our sin separates us from him. Throughout all of the Bible, we see people again and again separated from God because of sin. There's nothing they can do to fix that problem. It's a problem so big, no one can overcome it. Only God can. And he loves to redeem. He loves to keep his promise to solve that problem and to bring people close to him, to know him, and to be at home with him. God is so creative and powerful that he just had to speak to create the whole universe. Psalm 33:6-9 say, "By the word of the Lord the heavens were made, their starry host by the breath of his mouth. For he spoke, and it came to be, He commanded, and it stood firm. God made a holy, sacred place where he would dwell with the people that he had made, where he would be present with them, at home with them. Can you imagine what kind of world this God would make? Nothing but a perfect one. Genesis 1:31 says, "And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good." Everything was perfect, without sin, without sadness or sorrow or sickness or death. It was wonderful. And God made a special relationship with the people that he had made in his image. They would know God and walk with him and talk with him and love him and live under God's kind, kingly rule. God asked them to humbly, kindly, and wisely rule over all that God had made, to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And they were to have a perfect relationship with one another and with God. The one limit God gave was to not eat from the tree that would give them the knowledge of good and evil. They only knew good. But Satan crept into the garden looking like a snake, and he convinced the woman to eat from the tree that God had forbidden. Eve questioned whether God really knew what was right and best for her. God said, "It's not good for you. It'll bring death." And it's like Eve said, "I'll decide what's good for me." So Adam and Eve ate from the tree that God had forbidden. Immediately they were separated from the holy and perfect God in their hearts. They realized they were naked and they hid from God. God loved to live and walk and talk with them, but now that they had rejected him as their king and sinned, God could no longer live with them in the same way. And the land and Adam and Eve and the snake were all cursed. It always has consequences. They tried to be acceptable to God by making clothes out of leaves, but God showed them their sin had indeed brought death. At least one animal had to die that day to provide clothes for Adam and Eve. And Adam and Eve could no longer live in the holy, perfect garden with God. They had to leave the garden and go out of God's presence and out of the perfect place where God had dwelt with them. But God had a plan to restore all of creation and to bring people back to God. He started showing people that plan, his great mission, even before they had to leave the garden. On that sad day, God made a promise. In Genesis 3:15, it says, "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." God made a promise of a special child who would be born someday in the future, who would make all things right again. Outside the garden, everything was hard. Relationships were hard, growing food was hard, living was hard. They had to deal with new things like sickness and injury, and their bodies starting to grow old toward death. And in their hearts, instead of saying God first, they said me first. And every single person born outside of the garden would have that same me first attitude instead of God first in their hearts. Adam and Eve had a son, Cain, and then another, Abel. Maybe they thought, one of these must be the snake crusher who's promised to deliver us from the power of sin and death and restore all creation. They would soon discover that neither was the promised one. When Cain and Abel offered a sacrifice, Cain didn't offer a sacrifice that pleased God. Evidently, they knew from God what the right kind of sacrifice was. But Cain didn't offer one the God's way. He was angry when God wasn't pleased with his sacrifice. And God replied to him in Genesis 4:6-7, "Why are you angry, and why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at your door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it." God warned him to do the right thing, and if he did the right thing, God would be pleased with him and accept his sacrifice. But Cain didn't listen to God. He went out and killed his brother in his anger. There was a consequence for his sin as well. His punishment was to be a wanderer on the earth. But even in his punishment, God was merciful and gave him a special mark so that others would not see him and kill him. Adam and Eve had more and more kids. These kids grew up and had families of their own and started to fill the earth. Sadly, less and less people listened to God and wanted to be close to him. They started doing selfish things all the time. All the people said, "Me first," and the things they did got worse and worse. All except one. One man named Noah still loved and listened to God. Even with all the terrible things that people were doing, God showed mercy by giving the earth another chance through Noah. God called him to build a huge boat called an ark. And Noah listened to all of God's plans, and he followed each and every one. God sent Noah 2 of every unclean animal and 7 of every clean animal. By kind, we're thinking of the scientific definition of species. So, for example, for dogs, he would have only needed a pair of wolves, because out of wolves, genetically, you can get every other kind of dog. The ark was huge. It had plenty of room for all of the animals, all of the food that they would need, and for other people too. Noah warned the other people, but they just laughed at him. When the time came for the earth to be destroyed, only Noah, his 3 sons, and his 3 sons' wives got onto the ark. The punishment for sin had come. The ark was the only safe place. There was no saving outside of it. Today, we look to the promised one, Jesus. He is like the ark. Judgment will come for sin, and there's no safe place outside of him. When the water, which had covered all the highest mountains, went down, God was making the earth new again, and it was beautiful. Perhaps they wondered, is Noah the promised one? Is all creation going to be restored? But they soon discovered that Noah also had sin in his heart, and he was not the promised one. Out of the boat, we see drunkenness, dishonor, and cursing. This new family needed God's help to keep working out his plan. God was still merciful. God made a covenant with Noah. A covenant is like a special promise that a king would make between his vassals, his loyal followers. This covenant establishes a community, a life of sharing between God and his people, sharing similar ways of thinking and speaking and acting. At the heart of a covenant is love. And God's loving covenant with Noah was that he would never destroy the earth again by a flood. It was a promise to the whole earth. God told Noah the same thing he had told Adam, to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. But the people of the earth didn't like that idea, and they decided to build a big tower. We call that the Tower of Babel. They built this tower so they wouldn't have to spread out and fill the earth, and they built it to make a name for themselves in pride. But God knew that wouldn't be best for them. So in love and kindness, he created something new that was a punishment for them, a consequence of their sin. This new thing was languages. Instead of one language, the people now suddenly spoke multiple languages. So they found groups of people that spoke the same language of them, and they had to spread out and fill the earth. Noah's son Shem had children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren until 10 generations later, God chose a special family of people from the line of Shem in a man named Abram. This was incredibly merciful. Abram didn't deserve for God to choose him. He worshipped other gods that weren't real gods at all. God made a covenant with Abram. In Genesis 12, 1 through 3, it says, "Now the Lord said to Abram, 'Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Through Abram would come the promised one, who would bless all the nations of the earth. So Abram did the hard thing. He left all he knew. He went from Ur to Haran to Shechem, the land that God had promised, the land of Canaan. He took with him his wife Sarai and everything he owned. But there was a problem with this plan. He didn't have any children. How could God make him into a great nation if he had no children? So God took him out under the stars and had him look and see if he could count them. And he said, "That is how many children you will have. So many you could never count them, just like you can't count the stars." God's covenant came through sacrifice, and it came with a warning too. God said, "Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years." It was hard to think about this great nation to come from him when he had no children at all, and he and Sarai were too old to have children. But then 3 visitors came, and the Lord said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah your wife will have a son." You see, Abram's name was changed to Abraham, and Sarai was changed to Sarah. And when God gave this promise, Sarah was listening and she laughed. But God affirmed he would keep his promise, and they would have a son, and they would grow into a great nation. And through them, one would come who would bless all nations. Abraham and Sarah had their son Isaac. But when he grew up, God asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. Abraham was willing to love God and obey him no matter what God said, and he trusted that God could still keep his promise. And God saw Abraham's faith, and that he loved God more than the nearest and dearest thing to him. And God said, "Stop. I have provided a substitute for your son." There would come a time when the promised snake crusher, the one through whom all the nations would be blessed, would come to the earth, God's Son, and he himself would be the substitute for all mankind. And Isaac grew into a man, and in Genesis 26 we see that because of Abraham's obedience, God promised Isaac, "I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and will give you the offspring of these lands, and in your offspring all the nations of the earth will be blessed." That brings us to Isaac's son, Jacob. Abraham had not been the promised one. He'd let fear get the best of him, and he'd lied a number of times. Isaac had not been the promised one, so would Jacob? No, Jacob deceived and lied and cheated people. But God still reaffirmed the covenant that he had made with Abraham, and then his father Isaac, and then with him. And Jacob worshiped God, and he had a big family. We won't go into all the details of how, but he had 12 sons. And he had a favorite son, which caused lots of problems. His favorite son, Joseph, was a dreamer. God had sent Joseph dreams and the ability to understand them. And he had a dream that all of his brothers would bow down to him. When his brothers heard that dream, they were jealous and angry. They were also jealous and angry just for the fact that their father counted him as their favorite. And so they decided to kill him. But one of the brothers, Judah, said, "No, let's not kill him." They threw him in a pit, and they decided to sell him to some slave traders who were headed to Egypt. In Egypt, God did many things for Joseph, and Joseph worked hard and loved God. This very sad way of getting to Egypt turned out to be the only way to keep God's mission moving through history. You see, a time when there would be very little food was coming. God warned Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, in a dream, but Pharaoh didn't understand. So God used Joseph to explain to him what the dream meant. And Joseph had a good plan for Egypt, for how to store up grain for 7 years, so that when the 7 years of famine came, Egypt and the land around would have plenty of food. Pharaoh liked Joseph's plan, and he made Joseph second in command to him, so that when Joseph's brothers came hungry and needing to buy food years later, Joseph was the highest in command, second to Pharaoh. Joseph certainly had the power to get even with his brothers, but he didn't. He forgave them. We see what he said to his brothers in Genesis 50:20. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive, as they are today. Joseph trusted God, and he used his great power to bring all of his family to Egypt so that they could live and not die. And that was important because his brother Judah was the one through whom the Messiah was promised to come. Genesis 49:10 says, "The scepter will not pass from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his legs, until he comes, to whom obedience belongs, and it is he whom the peoples will obey." Before moving to Egypt, Judah and Joseph's other brothers had been tempted by the other nations living in the Promised Land at that time to sin against God and to follow other gods that weren't really gods at all. And so God moved Jacob and his other sons from Canaan to Egypt, where they could grow into a large nation. And this nation is referred to as the Israelites, and their land referred to as the land of Israel. Why? Well, because Jacob's name was changed to Israel, and all of his descendants and the Promised Land were named after him. 400 years went by of God's people living in Egypt and growing into a great nation. And then a Pharaoh came to power who did not know about Joseph. And he enslaved God's people and made them work under very difficult labor. And God's people cried out to him. God heard all their cries to him, just as he hears all of your prayers. How would he help? Well, through a baby. This special baby would be the deliverer of God's people, who would lead them out of Egypt back to their special land. But God's special deliverer was born at a really bad time. The king of the land, the Pharaoh, had commanded that all of the baby boys born to the Israelites be killed. His mother knew he was special, and she loved him. She put him in a basket, and that basket took him right into the Pharaoh's palace area, where one of the princesses of the Pharaoh saw him and took him to raise him as her own son, so that Moses, the baby, to be deliverer, would be a prince of Egypt. But in case anyone might be wondering if Moses was that promised snake crusher, the one through whom all the nations would be blessed, the ruler from the line of Judah, we can easily see he wasn't. He had a pretty bad temper. And while he was prince of Egypt, he saw how his people, the people of Israel, were being mistreated. And he got so angry at one of the people who were mistreating them one day that he killed him. And because of his angry act, he had to leave Egypt. And he went and for 40 years became a shepherd in Midian. Have your parents ever asked you to do something that you just didn't think you could do? Well, God appeared to Moses in the desert, in a burning bush, and God told Moses he was going to use Moses as the deliverer of all of the Israelites from Egypt. And Moses was scared. He told God he didn't think he was a good enough speaker to do that. But God was merciful to him. He sent him Aaron, Moses' brother, to help him speak. Together, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and told him God's command that God's people be brought out of Egypt to worship God. Pharaoh did not like that idea, and he was proud. He said, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go." Exodus 5:2. Now, do you ever get a consequence when you don't listen to your mom or dad? What if you don't listen again and again? Do your consequences get worse? God gave the Pharaoh 10 chances to listen to him and let his people go. Each time Pharaoh didn't listen to God, he received a consequence, and these consequences got worse each time. God kept giving him chances to listen to him and to know him, but he didn't. What he did do was to make God's people's labor more difficult and burdensome. And God's people cried out, but this time in complaints to Moses. They didn't like the way that this deliverance was happening. God proved to Pharaoh and all the people of Egypt that he alone is God, and he's more powerful than all the false gods that the Egyptians worshipped. He did this by using miracles that went directly against the so-called powers of certain gods of Egypt. The rivers turned to blood. The land was filled with frogs, then lice, and then flies. The livestock got sick. The people got painful skin sores. Hail destroyed crops and animals. Locusts ate up all their food. And darkness covered the land of the Egyptians for 3 whole days. The Egyptian gods, whom Pharaoh thought were supposed to be in charge of all these things, couldn't fix what the one and only God had done. Each time, Pharaoh had to beg Moses to ask God to take the plagues away, but he still wouldn't listen to God. The last and final plague would be the worst. God was merciful to warn Pharaoh and the people what would happen if Pharaoh still did not obey and let God's people go. Every firstborn son would die. But in God's mercy, God made a way of salvation. He told the Israelites to sacrifice a lamb and paint some of the blood on the outside of their house door. That night, the houses with the blood on the door would be passed over by the death angel. Every house that didn't trust God and his sacrifice awoke to great sadness, including the house of Pharaoh. Every year, the Israelites, or Jewish people, remember how God saved their firstborn by passing over them. They do this through the festival of Passover. Passover is celebrated close to Easter every year. All of the people who did not listen to God lost the firstborn son of their family. And Pharaoh had finally had enough. He finally let God's people go. Where would they go? Well, do you remember when Moses met with God at the burning bush? It was there that God said, "I will be with you, and this shall be a sign for you, that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain." So they were headed back close to where Moses had met with God at the burning bush, by what we refer to as Mount Sinai. God himself went with them and led them with a pillar of cloud during the day and a pillar of fire at night. But even with all the amazing things that God had done for them to deliver them, and even with the pillar of cloud by day and the fire by night, the people still did not trust God. Pharaoh looked around and realized that he'd lost much of his workforce. So he hardened his heart against God, and he pursued the Israelites, and they were terrified. They cried out to the Lord, and they said to Moses in complaints, "Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us in bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." And Moses replied, "Fear not, stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent." And so Moses raised his staff, and God parted the Red Sea, and God's people walked through on dry land, with the pillar of cloud behind them, protecting them from the Egyptians. And when the Egyptians tried to go through themselves, the waters closed back in upon them. And Israel greatly rejoiced in her deliverance. They sang a song to God. In Exodus 15:13, it says, "You have led in your steadfast love the people you have redeemed. You have guided them by your strength to your holy abode." You see, for just a minute, they were realizing that God all along had been leading them with his steadfast covenantal love. He was keeping all of his promises, and he was making a way to restore creation and to bring his people back to himself. They even said it. They called themselves the people that God had redeemed. To redeem means to restore what was lost. And God was working to restore everything lost at the fall when Adam and Eve disobeyed God. And God was leading them to a holy dwelling, to a special place where God would dwell with his people even more closely than before. But as faithful as God was, God's people were not very faithful to trust him. The land was very dry and not much grew there, and so the people realized they had no food, and they came and complained to Moses and Aaron. They basically said, "We wish that we had died in Egypt, because here there's no food." So God did a miracle to provide food for them. He sent them bread from heaven that they called manna. It was miraculous food. And as thankful as they must have been, they didn't follow God's instructions for how to gather it. Yet God was merciful and fed them with this miraculous bread from heaven for 40 years. Later they were thirsty, and they quarreled with Moses, and they said, "Give us water to drink." And again they complained, saying that they had been led out of Egypt just to die in the wilderness. So God provided water from the rock at Horeb. And God led them back to the mountain that he had promised Moses to bring him to. And the loving King, creator of all the universe, entered a covenant with his people. Remember, the heart of a covenant is love. He was entering into a special relationship with his people. He was renewing all the covenants he'd made before to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. And he was going to deliver his people into their land, into a special dwelling place with God. And God said in Exodus 19:5, "Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." Now remember that through the nation of Israel, that special promised snake crusher would come, the leader who would be a blessing to all nations. God loved all nations, and he wanted all nations to come to him. and he was offering the Israelites to be his kingdom of priests, to represent God to the people, and the people to God. The people were very quick to say, "All that the Lord has spoken, we will do." But when they saw the fire on the mountain and the mountain trembling, they got scared. And they told Moses, "You speak to us and we will listen, but do not let God speak to us, lest we die." So Moses went up on the mountain alone to meet with God. Remember that part of a covenant is that you're entering a relationship. God's people were to think about things and speak and act in a way that honored God and showed God to the world. God gave Moses good rules, also called the law, on the top of Mount Sinai to share with the people. They would follow those good rules and be his holy people so that they could stay close to God, stay focused on his mission for them, and stay at the center of God's blessing in the middle of the good land that God had promised. It didn't take the Israelites very long to break their end of the promise. While Moses was on top of the mountain talking to God and receiving the law for 40 days, at the base of the mountain, God's people had started worshiping other gods. God punished them, but he was still merciful. He still gave them his good law and his good promises that went along with it. The law wasn't just about obeying rules. It was about remaining in God's covenantal love. It was about knowing God and being close to him, being at home with him, and making him known to the other nations. Moses prayed for God to forgive the people, and God did, and he said, "Behold, I am making a covenant. Before all your people I will do marvels, such as have not been created in all the earth or in any nation, and all the people among whom you are shall see the work of the Lord, for it is an awesome thing that I will do with you." So God was going to show all the people among whom the Israelites were the work of his hand. He wanted to make himself known in all the earth. That's in Exodus 34. Since Moses had gotten so angry he had broken the first tablets of stone on which God had written, he had to have a second set written. The law of God showed the people just how much they needed God. The people just couldn't obey all the laws all the time without God's help and forgiveness. Just think, have you ever lied, disrespected your mom or dad, stolen something, loved something else more than God, or talked about God without respect? If so, you have broken some of the first laws in God's law that deserve to be punished, just as the Israelites did. But God was merciful, and he walked with his people. A pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night showed them where to go and showed them that God was present with them. God told his people how to make a special tent called the tabernacle that would represent God's presence dwelling in the middle of their tents. He told them how to make animal sacrifices to atone for sin. And the tabernacle was a place where they could come close to God, where God could be at home with them. As Noah carefully followed God's specific plans for the ark, through which the earth could have a second chance, Moses carefully followed God's specific plans for the tabernacle, where sin could be dealt with. God was coming near his people and showing them how to come near to him. God provided everything that was needed for the tabernacle through gifts that God put on the hearts of the people to give. He also provided the skill to make all of the things that went into the tabernacle. God provided, as he had done from all time, everything needed to come close to him and to have a relationship with him that was close, like being at home with him. In the whole Old Testament, there was no other prophet like Moses who talked to God face to face. But he was not the Messiah. He wasn't the promised snake-crushing, sin-crushing leader from the line of Jacob. He needed the Messiah just like everyone else. Since Moses wasn't it, the Israelite people kept looking for the promised one who would crush Satan and bring God's blessing to the whole world. They kept waiting for the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the prophet like Moses who would talk to God face to face. And while they waited, they were to live like the holy, different people God said they were, to follow his good law, to worship him alone at his tabernacle, and to bring his truth to others, and others to God as his kingdom of priests.